All right. Oh, hold on one second. Okay, there we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome to a special lecture in our series, which is a collaboration between the Lawrence Tech University College of Architecture and Design and the Humanity and Technology Lecture Series. My name is Emily Cudel. I teach in architecture. I'll say just a quick thing about the Lawrence Tech College of Architecture and Design. We offer degrees in architecture, interior design, graphic design, game art, transportation design, industrial design, and urban design. We're dedicated to a pedagogy of theory and practice, advocating not one or the other, but both, integrated and coherent. And we are very happy to be collaborating with the Humanity and Technology series today. And so I'd like to welcome Dr. Paul Jossen to introduce our speaker tonight.
Great, thanks, Emily. Oh, let me unmute. Oh, you can hear me. Thanks, Emily. I wasn't sure if I was muted or not. Yeah, it's great to be here, and I really love this collaboration. For those of you who might not know about Humanity and Technology, we're a lecture series that's been running for about 3 years now. We don't give quite as many talks as the CoAD series, but there are a lot of moments of close overlap. Our basic mission is to stage a public conversation about the world we make and what it means. Primarily focusing on the ways in which technology in its various forms sort of interacts with human culture, society, and the different ways in which we organize ourselves. We have a lot of friends in this series, and I just want to quickly acknowledge some of them. Most notably, the Michigan Humanities Council, which has been funding our lectures this year and is really making this event possible. So thank you to all of our various partners, and a special thanks to CoAD for allowing us to share this stage with them. I want to just quickly give you a save the date for our next event, which will be the last event of the normal academic year, although we are going to have a special event in May that I'll be announcing in the weeks to come. But Dr. Daniel Oberski from the Department of Methodology and Statistics and the Department of Biostatistics at the University of Utrecht will be giving a talk. And Dr. Oberski's work is really interesting to us because he is a data scientist who looks at data in the social sciences, but he has also done work on the history of statistics and the history of data science. So his talk is probably going to cover both the intellectual history of data science and how it emerged, but also the ways in which data science is used to capture and represent society. So we're really looking forward to that talk. That brings me to today's event and the special privilege of introducing Dr. Jentery Sayers. Dr. Sayers is Associate Professor of English and Cultural, Social, and Political Thought at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. So he's joining us from this afternoon as opposed to this evening. He directs the Praxis Study for Comparative Media Studies, whose work you'll be hearing more about tonight. And I will be sure to drop the link to that lab into the chat later on so you all can access it yourself. Dr. Sayers is the editor of Making Things and Drawing Boundaries, Experiments in the Digital Humanities, which was published by University of Minnesota Press. This collection of nearly 40 essays from 90 practitioners across 20 disciplines demonstrates the potential lines of affiliations between humanities scholarship and the rise of maker culture as that is broadly conceived. He has also edited the Routledge Companion to Media Studies and Digital Humanities, and is one of the co-editors of the Modern Language Association volume, Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities. I've also had the distinct pleasure of being a friend of Dr. Sayers for quite some time now, and he is one of the most exciting thinkers I know. He's always sort of reinventing the boundaries of whatever field he enters into, whether that's composition studies or sound studies or new media or digital humanities. And so when we launched this series, I knew that he would be a kind of perfect person to share his work. So I'm very excited to hear his talk tonight, which is entitled From Prototyping to World Building. Please join me in giving him a warm cyborg Zoom welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to it. And I just want to start by thanking everyone for taking the time. I've already heard how busy you are and how much you have on your plates. And I know it's already 6 p.m. on your time zone. So it means a lot to me that folks are here. What I'm going to do here, just take a second to share my slides. I want to also mention, just for the sake of access during and after the fact, they're online. With links in them as I go. So if you want to follow up on any of the work that I reference or what have you, you can do so via that URL. Hopefully it works. It should work. It was working a few minutes ago. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and share screen. You see that okay? Yeah, and can everyone hear me all right? Okay.
Yeah, we hear.
All right, thank you. All right. So yeah, as Paul already mentioned, my talk's called From Prototyping to Worldbuilding. He's already kind of covered all the material there on the title slide. So I'll just, before I begin my talk, I want to go through a series of acknowledgements. So I wanted to start by acknowledging that the University of Victoria, which is where I work and I teach here in British Columbia, is located on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich First Nations, whose ongoing historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And where I've been working most of the time during the pandemic is in a neighborhood called James Bay, which is just a block from what's frequently referred to as Beacon Hill, or the hill that's warmed by the sun, which is pretty key in a long history of the land because it's a part of the island that is home to some very important First Nations burial grounds. But also historically has been a place for First Nations to cultivate camas, for example, food source, and also play many sports and games. So it's been an honor for me to live in that space and to be a guest on these lands working at UVic. I also want to take a second to thank everyone that I've already communicated with and everyone that's been involved in this talk, making this happen. So Franco, Paul, Emily, Julia, am I pronouncing that right, Paul? Is it Julia? Yeah, Julia, and Tammy. So thanks. It's again an honor to be able to talk with you this evening. So a couple of things that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk just generally about this, an initiative that I built up at UVic with a number of researchers who I'll mention as I go, but broadly under the umbrella of prototyping the past. So I put dates on it, partly because those are the dates that we were doing the work in our space, but also the dates where we were getting research funding. So it was funded by two key units in Canada, the Canada Foundation for Innovation, and also the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, often referred to as SSHRC. And before I continue too, I just want to mention the researchers that I've worked with here. So specifically, they're Nina Bloyevich, Tiffany Chan, Nicole Clouston, Laura Dosky, Catherine Gertz, Evan Locke, Sean McPherson, Katie McQueston, Danielle Morgan, Victoria Morosky, and Zakir Varani. And we worked, those folks are all researchers across two primary faculties here at UVic, the Fine Arts faculty and Humanities. I myself am in the Humanities, but been working often over in visual arts in a space that we developed around 2013-14 called the Digital Fabrication Lab. So you might see some photos from that here and there. The Fab Lab is, I'm happy to talk about, like, if in the Q&A, if you want to talk about like infrastructure questions around this work, I think that would be really interesting. But one of the reasons that space is over in Fine Arts is, aside from the expertise there, is the fact that they're ready to do a lot of the work that we need when it comes to working with routers and lasers. And I don't know if Paul took that class, but I missed the grad seminar on lasers in the humanities. So I wasn't exactly trained in that. So collaboration throughout this work is pretty key. Sorry, that's a joke, because Paul and I went to grad school together. But yeah, so yeah, it's a prototyping the past. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a couple of examples. That's the prototyping part of this talk. And then I'm going to end by talking a little bit about where the research is going. That's mainly in the direction of the research around world building and what that means. Yeah, so a couple of motivations for this prototyping the past work that I'll just call PTP for the sake of brevity. I come at this primarily when I was writing the grant and doing the early work, especially on it, as someone who does work in comparative media. And for the sake of this work, kind of cultural history of media or media history. right? And so one of the things I wanted to get at with prototyping in the past was first to look at labor and material process in media history. Labor is a really tricky thing to write about when you're talking about old media or old technology because you weren't there, and often it goes poorly documented, right? So I'm interested, for example, in the labor of maintenance, as well as the labor of innovation, right? So you'll probably see that kind of refrain throughout the next few slides. Another one is to add depth and lived experience to those histories. So what I mean, and I'm going to give an example here in a moment, is, if you will, taking a lot of the media history off the page, right? Documentation you might find in an archive or you read in a book, and getting a better sense of how that 2D actually unfolded in 3D, right? So you can think of like schematics that you often see in technology history, or even like drawings, and often sometimes photographs. But I also mean in terms of lived experience, the lived experiences of researchers today, right? So what it means to have an understanding of how, for example, the media or the technology that you're studying actually worked in the spaces that they worked in. Yeah. So you might, I don't know, it's in my university, this is occasionally called experiential learning. I don't know if that's a phrase that your university uses, but something like that, right? So the studio and lab environment is pretty key for this work. A third one is attend to the contingencies and conjectures of design. So what I mean by this is just, if you have, for example, a schematic, or you have a description, historical description, a patent even for a given device, better understanding like the situations under which that worked, right? These could be technical, but they're also, as I hope to demonstrate, also quite social. And I'm actually going to point later to how maybe contingency is a limitation of this work. It's such an emphasis on contingency that it might miss the kind of bigger world building questions that we're also interested in now. And then my last 2 points are more methodological. So what we ended up doing over this period of 5 years is we remade tech that no longer exists or existed only as a fiction, right? So what do we mean by no longer exists is they're either you can't find them, they've been disposed of, they've been thrown away, they're not treated like art objects, right? Or if they do exist, they're in collections, say, for example, here, one of the key ones would be in Ottawa. It's the collection of science, Canadian Science and Technology. They might be available on shelves, but they don't work anymore. Or if they do, if they could work, you probably don't want to work with them because of hazardous materials and whatnot, right? But we're also, we looked into quite a bit of like kind of conjecture or kind of speculative design, early drawing sketches of pieces that we wonder if they were ever made, and we're never quite sure if they were. Right. And then finally, borrowing heavily from Daniela Rosner's work over at the University of Washington in engineering there, we like to treat prototyping as an inquiry. So what we mean by this basically is an emphasis on prototyping as a way of learning, as a kind of trial and error negotiation, rather than having a goal at the end to produce a product for people to use, right? This is not a critique of the latter, it's just that our expertise lies more in the former. It's to think through the materials we have ready to hand. Right. And yeah, if you want to follow up, I put some links there on some publications that came out of it, but also a video that students made about the work that we're doing across visual arts and humanities at UVic. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. One, I'm going to kind of go through quickly, and I might stop if you want and answer some quick questions about it. And then I'm going to go through another example that's more in depth. The first example is going to be about early history of magnetic recording, which came out of my dissertation work at the University of Washington. And then my second example is going to be about optophonics, which is slightly more recent work. Optophonics is basically the translation of text into audible tones, right? So yeah, the first example. So yeah, I'm going to go through magnetic recording. And when people hear magnetic recording, they tend to think of the 1940s and forward, especially after World War II and the US context. Jack Mullins often comes up using it in Hollywood after magnetic recording was developed heavily in Denmark and Germany during and after World War II, or sorry, before and during World War II. But there's a longer history of it that dates back to really the 1870s, early ideations of it. And then it goes into the 1890s where in Copenhagen, someone by the name of Valdemar Poulsen is speculated to have made it to develop early magnetic recording, right alongside really the development of phonography with work by, for example, Emil Berliner and of course, Thomas Edison in the 70s and 80s, right? But here's the thing, when I was doing the research, this is the kind of evidence I had to go on. right? So I get these stick figure illustrations. This one's by Marvin Camrus, who's a noted kind of engineer and developer of magnetic recording, and then later, after all of his expertise, started to do some more historical work and wrote a handbook on magnetic recording that featured this. And it really stuck out to me doing early archival work. I'm like, this happened? Did this work? So I started looking. You can see there's not a lot of details here, but we have a carriage, we have steel wire, and we have a magnet. And presumably, what you would do is you would speak in to the telephone transmitter as the carrier went down on the magnet, and then you'd run it back again to hear it, right? So this is done in principle before amplification, specifically electric amplification, was thoroughly developed. So the playback would have been very difficult to hear, if not often inaudible. But those of us who are in the lab were kind of curious, like, to what degree could you take this stick figure illustration off the page? Again, an illustration by Camrus in the 20th century of an experiment that ostensibly occurred around 1897 in Copenhagen, involving Valdemar Poulsen in a cabin somewhere. Right. So this is what we got, and this is just an example of the kind of materials that we're working with. So in the lab, we started doing that work using things like a laser cutter and schematics, the Adobe suite, to start running these early audio experiments in the visual arts building. And so here pictured is researcher Catherine Gertz. And she's using a transmitter and parts from a telephone from the period that we sourced. I ended up spending a lot of time on eBay for this work, but I got this one in particular that's dated somewhere, we think, between like 1890, around 1890 to 1905, right? And yeah, we started running the experiments. And then we thought, well, one way to get people to maybe better understand how this worked, or just to kind of pique their interest in sound reproduction and its history writ large, is to open it up into an exhibit or a gallery space. So we had several years ago in the summer, we had an exhibit called Jakob, Recording on Wire. Why Jakob? Jakob is, as the lore goes, the name that Poulsen repeatedly shouted into the transmitter. We're unsure. Jakob could have been a friend that was at the cabin. We don't know. Could have been a partner. Could have been a family member. We're unsure. But there's a lot of speculation that Jakob, maybe because also the strong syllables, or the differentiation in the syllables, was often used and shouted. So we thought we'd try that. And we ran the experiment over a period of few days in a studio environment. This is in the Aldane Gallery at the University of Victoria in Fine Arts. And folks came in and tried it on their own, ran it on the wire that was mounted on both sides of the gallery space. And here you can see what people are taking photos of is actually where they think their recordings are. And then they would label them, and we would identify or kind of mark those recordings with filings, right, where the magnetism is. And then they would write what they said next to it. It ended up being kind of neat because it became a space for us to just talk about media history and to get people more familiar with an aspect of media history that they may not know about, but also to kind of manifest the kind of lived social experience of technology as more than a thing, or as more of as more than an object in the world, right? As a social situation with many contingencies. And so on the whole, what was kind of interesting is most people said that they did in fact hear their recording on wire when they ran it back down. But they often wondered if they were just kind of imagining that recording, right? So it's as if the wire was kind of haunted, right? With these voices that were just recorded on the wire. And many people remained very kind of unsure as to what degree, if at all, they could hear their own voices on it. We then also took, at the back of the gallery space, we took that phone that we had been taking apart, and we made it such that you could lift it and listen to some audio about the history of the audio recordings itself, including our stick figure illustration, and a little bit more about how it worked, why it was developed, and so on. Just if you're interested in the technical side of this, the way it worked is it just had a Raspberry Pi, a little kind of microprocessor on the inside that was triggered when you lifted the handle there, and it would just pick up where the essay left off, and it had just a small MP3 file on it that ran on a loop. Right. So that's just a kind of brief introduction into one of our projects. This again is about early magnetic recording. The idea that, again, you could think of it as a series of contingencies and an experience, and more than something that's just say, an object in an archive, or more than a stick figure illustration or an artifact or a schematic or pattern on a page. I mean, I'm happy to stop and take any questions you have about this, or I could just keep going. Anyone have maybe in chat or anything, a question or
I have a small question.
Yeah,
I'm very curious about if you go to the previous slide.
Sure.
So I can see that when you have a audio editing software, right? You have this. It looks like Jacob, right? This thing, the two syllables that are reflected like in the frequencies and the amplitudes. Is it something like that?
Yeah. So yeah, it looks a lot like a spectrogram, right? The iron filings are just reflecting in a way that, I mean, it's maybe formally similar, but obviously technically very different than a spectrogram. But yeah, it's a visualization of what's on the wire. But yeah, in fact, I wish it were more visible, but that tag is the Jakob tag, which I should have made clear when I was speaking earlier. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Franco. Any other questions about this? Well, I'll go on to the other one. It's a little bit more in depth, but this is my kind of brief example to give you an example, a kind of a sense of what we've done with some of the prototyping thus far. Other prototypes we made included some early wearables. Was actually a pin that had a laughing skull head that was meant to go into the cravat, that was then tied to a battery and a coat. But I can talk about that during Q&A if you're really interested in wearables from the mid-19th century. They were kind of dangerous, just as an aside, especially when you wore them in your hair. All right, so this is the second one I'm talking about, optophonics. And I want to dig a little bit more into the historical particulars about this one. But we've been doing work on this for a few years now. And this research, I want to note, the slides you're going to see were developed by myself, but also Tiffany Chan, who was a master's student at the time, is now at UVic Libraries, works in digital scholarship in our libraries, as well as Mara Mills at New York University, who's in, I believe it's media, culture, and communication there, and is a historian, not only of sound, but also of disability. So you're going to see those two overlaps here. And my kind of pithy version of optophonics is, in terms of its kind of historical relevance, is that what you see here is essentially an early history of optical character recognition. Optical character recognition being the primary technology that's used so that you can search books on Google, for example, character by character, word by word. In that when you're looking at OCR, I hope one of the things that this project demonstrates is that OCR has a long history in disability in Europe and in North America, and that one of the aims of this project was to kind of foreground the role of disabled developers, disabled demonstrators in the work that was not only underpaid, or if paid at all, but hardly recognized in media history. Right. So it's mostly, in the last instance, a kind of labor history of sound and disability technologies, often also called assistive technologies. So the optophone, what it does, the optophone takes patterns and converts them in, patterns of type, and converts them into audible tones. Right. And again, this is one way you can think of it. It might look like a copy machine there, but it's also very much like the way in which computer vision might now scan a page image and produce a text file from it that is searchable. It was initially developed, the one that we're looking at is initially developed in the UK, in the United Kingdom in the 1910s, to give blind readers direct access to ink print materials such as books, as you can see there. And it actually was developed pretty extensively. And one of the things we're interested in actually is the iterative development of this, not that it just kind of fell from the sky and stayed the same for several decades, but it was constantly iterated. And it was often iterated, mostly iterated in the context of post-World War II rehabilitation, right? So the context of technological development here is tied to rehabilitation, including, as you would probably assume, rehabilitation for veterans. if it's hard, you can't see it by looking at this image. It might help as you see some of the ones I'm about to show on the slides. But what you have here are 6 to 8 beams of light that go driven by selenium. That's kind of the primary ingredient, if you will, or mechanism for the optophone, that are stacked. These beams of light are stacked vertically that correspond with different points on a letter. And I'll demonstrate that. Tiffany produced a kind of demo of how this would have worked, since we don't have one to be abundantly clear, ready to hand that we can use and operate at this time. Right. There are some in the archives, for example, in the UK. So here are 2 more figures so you can get a better sense of it. But when people hear optophones, what they actually often tend to think about initially, especially in media history, is sonification. Right. I don't know if anyone in the group has like done work on, say, for example, the modernist avant-garde in Europe, especially. But there was some avant-garde experiments by the Dadaists that used selenium and optophonics to turn light into sound. Right. But what we're looking at here is specifically the reading optophone. Right. So not optophonics writ large, but specifically the reading optophone, which again, the primary purpose of which was to turn patterns into audible tones. Right. You could call this like the sonic equivalent of transcription. Yeah. And yeah, so I want to kind of think through them basically as transcription and historically probably more accurate translation devices. That word was often used almost interchangeably with transcription in the 1910s to the 1930s. So here I have a comic of all things. If you're in design, I'm going to apologize to you in advance for this slide. I didn't design it originally, but it's also kind of hard to read. But you can just see an attempt here to describe what is happening in this kind of comic-like illustration of the optophone. I think this is dated roughly in the late 1920s, but it might be as late as the 1930s. But you can see, for example, the role of the selenium rod there in the middle, and the importance that the operator, the important role that the operator would play in moving the book up and down. Moving the light up and down, the selenium rod up and down to read the book, right? So this maybe to state the obvious, despite that it's rhetorically framed at the time as a technology of automation, is highly manual. And one thing I want to get at here in a bit is the degree of expertise that it took to operate this machine and turn text into sound, and then convert what was heard, translate what was heard into words that blind operators were reading or hearing. My rough estimate that I also that's corroborated by Mara Mills's work at NYU is that the first one was announced by a fellow named E.E. Ferney-Daub in 1913 and developed primarily in the 1920s. 2 things I want to get at as I kind of unpack why to prototype this machine is, one, historically, what tends to happen, as it did actually with the case of Ferney-Daub, is the machine gets assigned to whoever patented it or thought of it, right? Histories of technology and media often ignore the development, the maintenance, the repair of the device, right? And so this kind of lone male inventor history of technology that tends to persist. The second one is that in history, even of media and technology, this technology, the reading optophone, tends to be framed as obsolete, quote unquote obsolete. Right? So why study an obsolete technology today? And hopefully I can show why or get at it. So I think just a heads up, what I'm going to do now is give you a sense of what it would have sounded like. Again, this is a demo produced by Tiffany Chan here at UVic, and it's going to show you how the selenium, those rays of 6 to 8 beams of light, would have gone over letters and produced motifs of sound that would then be translated into words. So just a heads up, if you want to turn your they're going to be tones. They could be quite loud. You might want to turn your volume down. I'll give you a second to do it if you want. And there, those of you who do work on optical character recognition may almost immediately identify how that works, right? That there might be a computer. It is different, of course, but computer vision will scan a page discretely and produce text from the page image, turning the image into text, into ASCII text, usually, I think. right? But yeah, in this case, you have, the scale passing over the printed letters. And what Tiffany did here was take the historical image and simulate, would probably be the best word for this, what it would have sounded like. And keeping in mind too, that this would have been an incredibly private listening experience, right? Much like people might associate reading as a kind of mostly private reading experience. Or put differently, as say books, especially things like the novel, had to invent readers or make readers, produce readers, the optophone also had to produce listeners, and those listeners had expertise. So one of the things that Mara, Tiffany, and I, with folks at the lab, were arguing is that the people who are developing the optophone, optophonics, are not mere end users, right? They're not consumers. The readers are their developers, as I'm going to show here in a little bit, and they worked closely with manufacturers to improve the device. The primary manufacturer that I can determine at this time was a company called Barr and Straub. I think throughout the first half of the 20th century. And so to frame this differently, say from the perspective of disability history, you could say that basically sighted readers were far less experienced in actually using the machine that many of them developed. And so it was essential to have the expertise of blind readers and blind developers in the development of optophonics, which again, I'm suggesting informs current day OCR. So the person I want to focus on is a developer, a reader, a technician, an expert by the name of Mary Jamison. Mary Jamison is, to Mara, Tiffany, and I's knowledge, or my knowledge, the first celebrity optophone reader. And she used it daily and tested subsequent American models. I think there was one in America, maybe you've come across it somehow, called the Visitoner, that was quite popular after the development in England. And she started using it, by my estimates, around the age of 18, encountering actually Ferney-Daub. I think it was the University of London Club to do more work with it, and ultimately actually to teach optophonics for, by our estimates, several decades. So not only was she a developer, she would feed back to companies how to improve the machine, but she would also teach other blind readers how to use it. And what we found in doing this work is once you kind of locate it in the particular labor practices of someone such as Mary Jamison, is that you do not, maybe to state the obvious, want to assume that prototyping can somehow assume the embodied subject experience of someone in the past, in our case, especially a blind optophone reader, right? So it isn't about going back and being in someone's shoes, if you will. It is, in fact, about using prototyping to show you the gaps in the knowledge that you have and the kind of differences between now and then, right? And so hopefully I'll be able to outline here in the next few minutes some of those key differences. But I'll speak a little bit more to Jamison's history. Again, she was doing a lot of work educating blind readers, testing the machine. And again, I think she started this around age 18 in London. We've also read, based on her notes and other documentation, that within about 18 months of learning it, she had an average reading speed of 40 words per minute on the machine, and the fastest was probably up to 60 words per minute. I am trained in literary studies, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the first book she read was Anthony Trollope's The Warden, published in 1855. She was quite a fan of this book. And yeah, so she did many demonstrations throughout. Those of you who are like familiar with, say, for example, Carolyn Marvin's work on the demonstration, right, of new technologies, public demonstration, would know how important demonstrations, say, at the World's Fair are in the 19th and 20th centuries. But yeah, demonstrations were yet another way that she performed and communicated her expertise at scientific exhibitions, medical societies, nearby schools and universities. And she did so early on, I think voluntarily. She was only compensated for her work later in her career. I think at the earliest, maybe roughly about a year and a half into her career. And again, yes, she often taught. One of her key roles was also pedagogical, teaching other blind readers how to use the optophone. I think she continued to use the optophone and similar devices up into the 70s. And so the optophone became central to her everyday life. She used it to read books. She used it to read food labels. She used it to read her mail. Again, when we were first doing this work, documentation of this by scholars of media history, including scholars of reading devices, reading machines, and specifically the optophone, did not mention her, right? Or if they mentioned her, it was only in passing, say in the occasional footnote or endnote, right? But by our estimate, she was probably the key figure in the 19th century, in the 20th century for the development of optophonics, or specifically reading optophonics. Mara and I, with Tiffany, kind of came up with a kind of key observation that we had here. And I just, for the sake of fidelity, I'm going to read it aloud. And it's our position here on what prototyping helps us do. And I'm going to show you a few examples of how we tried to prototype this device, again, since we didn't have it ready to hand in working fashion. Prototyping is not about replicating the original optophone or reclaiming embodied translation experiences, such as scanning, listening, and interpretation. So yeah, again, it's not about trying to replicate the original, right? Trying to go back and be in someone else's shoes, or to reclaim a technology as if it exists as it once did yesterday, somehow today. It instead turns our gaze, this is again a quote from the work that Mara, Tiffany, and I produced. It instead turns our gaze outward to scrutinize how reading practices and identities materialize and congeal with and through technologies, and to reflect our own embodied relationships with machine work, right? And so I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how that manifested in the lab. This idea of turning the gaze outward to scrutinize, you could put this really basically, the values of the present when we're working with technologies as we study historical devices, as we study old media. And so one of the things that we did was specifically Tiffany developed some code to take optical character recognition today using a Raspberry Pi, and she created a script that didn't exist, that you couldn't find, and for scanning books. And it ended up being a kind of neat script for people that do archival work too. Like if you wanted a portable scanner, you could use this script. And one of the things we kind of quickly noted is as you use today's computational devices to try and understand historical ones, some of them are quite obvious, but the most palpable one we saw within the kind of first few months of research is with the optophone, the font or the typeface is incredibly important, right? So you have to think about, for example, the typefaces that books that were intended for optophonics would use. You cannot, just assume that all typefaces will have the same results, or in this case, the same sounds and motifs. So you'd have to be familiar with, graphic design, and more specifically with typefaces and typography to understand this history, and thus Jameson and other blind readers were too. Again, the typeface mattered. This is perhaps a technical issue, but we thought it was quite interesting. And another one is that when you're using a device like this, a script like this, to scan today's books using a computer, it's going to scan the pages discretely, yeah, character by character, rather than continuously, right? So it's not going to have the manual operation using the selenium rod that Jameson would have used, right? So you then see yet another gap on how difficult it is to understand how the optophonics work, and how optophonics worked in the 1920s, because today's technologies work differently. Even though there's a kind of history of optophonics in today's OCR, there has been iterative change that's created enough gap between them, if you will. But I think more interesting is the fact that as OCR develops and a lot of automation develops, one of the things that results from it is this emphasis on efficiency, right? The idea of being able to access a book and quickly search it. The idea of being able to scan a book quickly with small devices at this point and make them readable by a computer for computer vision, and again for human searching, it tends to actually obscure the labor that subtends its historical activities, right? So the emphasis on efficiency today can easily kind of ignore, for example, the contributions that Jameson put into this work, right? All of her contributions for decades that went into present day OCR. So again, rhetorics of efficiency, innovation, obscure, ignore, elide these histories of maintenance. And in this case, again, to be abundantly clear, the histories of development and maintenance by a blind developer, Mary Jameson, right? And so you can think of this rhetorically too, in theories of technology, that rather than for us adopting a language of like rupture, new technologies replace old ones, that what you really see between the 1920s and today, a century, is a series of kind of smaller gains and losses over time, right? And again, for at least 5 decades, Jameson is the primary contributor to those smaller losses and gains. It is not, as is often historically noted, it is not Fernie Dahl, who was patenting, like many people at the time, many things and many new devices. So one of the ways of looking at the optophone is that we're not after, at this point, like creating an ideal one in 2021 or in the 21st century to learn from Jameson's work to build a better one. But really to say that that ideal optophone, it never existed, right? It was always iterative, it was always changing, it was always modified, right, over time, kind of like a lot of software is today, right? Look at something like GitHub and its constant iteration there. So what I'll do is I'll show you a couple of examples of some of the prototyping work we did with the optophone. Key to it was early on the use of CoAD and scripting in environments such as this one. Tiffany wrote this in Sublime Text, and it's intended, again, it's a script intended for a Raspberry Pi. But another thing we did is we cut it using a laser cutter, using diagrams that we had available at the optophone. So we made smaller versions of it. And then we could easily just kind of cut it out and put it together. And this is the kind of case, I work with a lot of students from the humanities, right, where they can just take a simple kind of paint file, basically, right, a simple image file, and feed it to a laser, kind of like you would a copy machine in some degrees, but it's for etching and cutting rather than copying. And this is just a kind of quick, very open and low-tech version of what Tiffany did to start scanning books. So this is the roughly the original frame. It's made smaller to size for use. And she fed a small Raspberry Pi into it, and then she could put glass or plexi over it and then scan books with this small camera and, again, this Raspberry Pi and the script she produced. And it was pretty neat to see people use this, but what was most palpable often was the amount of manual labor and expertise that would be required to turn what the book that was on the optophone into a series of audible tones. We did not in the lab ever develop the expertise for listening at the rate of 40 words per minute, let alone 60 like she did. And I don't believe any of us ever finished listening to Trollops the Warden. But back to Jameson, and I want to kind of close here with a few remarks about world building. So what we've learned about this prototyping work and where we're going with it. One of the things that's key about this history, kind of attending to the labor history and the disability history and optophonics, again, which feed into OCR, is the degree to which the listening experience is entwined with the tactile experience, right? So you can't, fetishize different areas of expertise and parse them out as if the ear is separate from the hand in this case. But again, as well, the degree to which manual operation fed into the ostensibly or rhetorically automatic translation of text to sound for listeners or for blind readers in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Finally, again, the number of improvements that Jameson recommended based on her reading practices over a series of decades, improvements which, to our knowledge, were not well documented, but fortunately folks such as Mara Mills are doing that work on the media history side to make visible, Mary Jameson's otherwise overlooked work. And again, the idea here is that we learned importantly that it's far more productive when standing from the kind of present moment and looking back at old technologies to see them as a series of iterative developments, not new technologies that fall from the sky and change things, right? But there's a small bit of progress over time. There's a small bit of gains and losses. There's not always necessarily progress either. I didn't mean to put it in those terms. And part of this is then looking at a not necessarily innovation or new patents or new ideas that are initially written and circulated, but rather histories of maintenance and repair over time. And again, influential to us here was the work of Daniela Rosner, especially her early work on Rosner, her early work on care and repair. So what I'm going to do is just kind of close with a final few words about where we're going with this work. Again, at UVic across fine arts and humanities, and specifically the idea of prototyping the past becoming something else. So we noticed, if you will, that there were kind of a couple shortcomings of prototyping the past, even if the kind of key idea was to look at, again, not simulating past events by recreating devices, but rather attending to all the differences and the things that could not be replicated over time. But one of them was that it is very conducive in its emphasis on storytelling. We were, for example, far more aware of the lore and the storytelling that comes out around devices such as the reading optophone, such as early magnetic recording experiments. We became more aware, more cognizant of the centrality of storytelling in the development of those devices, including the degree to which a lot of early technologies in their development and circulation, they're quite hyperbolic in their language, all the things that they possibly can do. But I think what we ended up missing in a lot of the focus on contingency and the focus on especially the individual story were some broader contexts and if you will, the engines for storytelling. So I would like to point people to the work of Sullivan, Yavis, and Snyder. They've written some great work on 3D historical models as a kind of point of comparison here. So context is really key here, and just the fact that they develop, for example, 3D models of world exhibitions in places such as Chicago that happened over a century ago, right? And I think having a better sense of those contexts would improve, having a better sense of the worlds that are built around these stories would improve the prototyping work. But I also make it, I also mean it in terms of the engines that are used to produce stories. So the fact that Sullivan, Yavis, and Snyder are well-versed in GIS and 3D modeling engines, right? The software that helps us produce simulations or models of the past. And so becoming more aware of those particular forms of software would be important. We focused rather more on the script and the kind of particular things rather than bigger engines, or if you like, infrastructures for computing. So that's one, is a kind of getting at the world building in the sense of the context that's constructed around the technologies and media we're studying, and not just the particular devices and the stories of, say, the developers, the maintainers. A second one is looking at developing a better sense. I think what world building will do is help people build a better sense of the conditions that encourage both capacity and what's called debility. Here I'm thinking specifically of the Esbjerg Puar's work on debility. But this is the idea that an emphasis too much on, say, the history of particular iterations of optophone or on Jameson risks overlooking, if you see Puar's work, the slow process through which change happens, and through which people are either through which capacity is given to more people through technology, or in which they're put increasingly debilitating situations, right? So a question here, if you go back to Jameson, would be the degree to which she was working in a kind of systematic situation where the reason that she's not, aside from the fact that the gender and politics and the disability politics, or her lack of recognition historically, was also the fact that she was working over time in a situation of technological development where she was not being given capacity to encourage her work to persist, right? That she was in conditions that facilitated debility rather than building capacity, right? And so Puar's work is primarily grounded in the role that colonialism plays in debility and debilitating conditions. And we were interested in kind of mapping that onto, or creating correspondences with that in histories of technology and media. Again, how it is that technology and media writ large create debilitating conditions for people and yet build capacity for others. Right. So if again, you're going to look at a history of labor and ask who wasn't recognized, what conditions led to that, what conditions of capacity and debilitation. And then finally, a kind of more pragmatic note, and I'll close here, We became increasingly interested, full aware of the fact that people don't have ready access to laser cutters and routers, to low-tech approaches to world building, low-tech approaches to prototyping. So we drew heavily on Hannah Perner Wilson's work. She has a project called The Kit of No Parts, which was really great. It looks at individual parts of given devices and assumes that you don't build something with a kind of ideal model or schematic in mind. And what that also allowed us to do was to do a lot more work with things like paper, remade materials, materials that would otherwise be disposed of, and also in the classroom context, especially important for me, to introduce students to things that they, where they, processes, techniques that they wouldn't need, say, complicated software, technical expertise, and certainly not a laser cutter or router to do, right? And so, yeah, if you look at actually a lot of world building, I'm, for example, always very interested in the development of world building as a technique of science fiction and fantasy in the 20th and 21st century. A lot of that can be theater of the mind, right? Or a lot of it can be, it happened in the novel. You didn't need all of these otherwise expensive technologies that are not inclusive to unfold. And so we've been looking more again at strategies, pedagogies that are low tech after doing this work for roughly 5 years. And with that, I'll conclude and once again, thank Franco, Paul, Emily, Julia, and Tammy, and everyone else at LTU for inviting me today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sayers, for that super interesting talk. I want to just invite everybody who is watching on the YouTube live stream to also ask questions. You can paste them in the chat and I will ask them to Dr. Sayers. And would just invite anyone listening on the Zoom to unmute and ask a question or paste it in the chat as well.
So I do believe I got a question from Amity.
Yes, Amin. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Amin. Yeah, you. I believe you asked what were some of the challenges you guys faced during testing?
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, a number of them. So from a historical perspective and an archival perspective, it was actually premised on a challenge, which was when you want to do work on an object of inquiry that's not in the archive, right? So what do you do? Or if it's in the archive, what do you do when it doesn't work? But also more pragmatically, one of the key ones was expertise, how you define that. And so we relied heavily on collaboration. This work would be impossible without work, for example, by visual artists and designers, especially work involving exhibits, work reading, historical diagrams, but also a lot of the laser cutting stuff.
So how has like old patents and things function different back in the day, right? So how did you guys I'll say kind of evolve that to like modern functionality?
Yeah, well, sometimes we couldn't or we didn't, and yeah, and so sometimes those impossibilities were actually interesting to us. So for one, it would be really easy to look at OCR and optophonics and go, look, it's a general process of translation from one medium, text, to another medium, either sound or searchable text, right? If you try and do that just simply with a computer today using an OCR script, what you're missing or what you can't transfer, I would say, is the manual process of guiding the book or guiding the 6 to 8 beams of light to scan the book and listening to it as you go. So those differences, or where you couldn't collapse the past and the present through technologies, were actually our kind of that form of mediation was fascinating to us, not only as a technical question, but also as one of social history and labor history.
Right. I mean, one great example I have, because I've worked with a lot of engineers through CCS. I don't know if you heard of CCS, College of Creative Studies. So in high school, I was actually involved in automotive design, graphic fashion, and even architectural. So they were trying to recreate a vehicle back in the day. It was called the Chrysler turbine car. And now they can't do it even with the modern technology and aspects, because, I mean, that car was so, I guess, versatile. You can run it with even perfume, anything with a little bit of flammable material, it can still run. So, I mean, I think that's kind of unique, and it goes back to your point that, historical data, even though it's hard to kind of analyze it and put it into an algorithm, you kind of have to test back and forth and see what makes sense, right? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think of all the ones we did, probably the wire recorder was closest, if you will, to an original. And again, a lot of the results that we got out of that exhibit, you might call it an experiment too, were fascinating because we didn't consider them by solely doing work that was archival, right? Because it was all mostly 2D work, if you will. It was all on the page, and it was premised on reading, that most kind of scholars of media history are trained in, and they're not typically trained in understanding how the stuff on the page actually unfolds in 3D space with
that is difficult, bringing something on a page to reality.
Yeah. So. I saw you had a question, Paul. Did you ever encounter situations in which the expertise has been lost, forgotten techniques, capacities, craft knowledge? Yeah, absolutely. So I think the most palpable would be the reading expertise of someone such as Mary Jameson being able to read the Warden at 40 to 60 words per minute. I wasn't able to find anyone that had that kind of expertise in optophonics, but also actually in the most banal way, identifying which wire would have been used for the magnetic wire recording. We went to local experts with piano wire to actually better understand the question of like the diameter that would have been used and the kind of types of wire that would have been available at the time. And a related one on the work that we did for early wearables, a lot of that involved clockwork, very meticulous machine work with miniatures, right? There was one expert here who fixed clocks from the 19th and 20th century, and went back and forth with us, asserting that what we were looking at, in this case of this early wearable, had very fine craft work, would have been impossible. And so he went through the historical documentation, like no one could have built this to work in roughly 1860 to 1870. They would not have had the means. This person it's just all exaggeration. This is they fooled people into thinking it worked at the time when maybe it didn't. And we're still never sure whether it was. Yeah, those are just a few.
That's super interesting. Just as a comment, it makes me think of conversations about dying languages, right? So in one sense, we might think of the history of tech as sort of a history of techniques and crafts like languages or to use another one of your words, sort of world-making capacities. And I'm wondering how that might feed back into your point about the kind of dialectic between capacity and debility. Like there's things that are sort of gained and lost in that history. But yeah, really interesting.
I've got a question.
Yes, please.
It sounds as though one of the things that you're accomplishing is kind of revealing the underlying form and function of things that we just take for granted. For example, someone walks in, uses their key to open the car door and turns the key and starts the car and may not even know what's under the hood. And in today's world, you don't even have to put the key in. It's got a proximity sensor there. So in one sense, what you're doing is offering a way in to understand better what underlies and sustains the technology that is beginning to look and feel more like magic to us.
So I'll get to the first bit there before I get to magic, because magic always fascinates me in the context of histories of media and technology. But what I would say is, yes, that is to some degree part of it, especially if you look at how disciplines unfold. And so it is not atypical, as I mentioned a bit ago, for scholars of media and history to be unaware of how maybe the devices that they study worked, or to have training, say, for example, in technical history in the engineering of those devices. So yes, some understanding of that is vital. But equally important to us was actually just the fundamental question of, like, when you're studying things that are on the page, when you're studying historical accounts of technologies, when you should assume that the account is accurate, and when you should assume that, say, the presentation at a demonstration or just the sketch actually manifested in the thing that was operative, right? So the degree to which rhetoric, and you could even say fiction, played a role in histories of technology and media. One of the things that's quite convincing is that people can imagine the thing in the world without necessarily seeing it developed or let alone proliferating. And then also just kind of really basically is going through, as in the case with Jameson, and pointing out the missed, overlooked, elided histories, including hers, of, in this case, women in technology, disabled people in technology that were key to its development, but haven't been recognized in the scholarship. But yeah, the technical particulars matter. As for magic, I'm actually interested in sustaining a certain degree of magic. I guess the joke, right, is that, successful magic following Clark's law, technologies are indistinguishable from magic when they function successfully. And so I would look at the prototyping work and say that one of the goals was not actually to necessarily explain away history, but to render more palpable the things that you won't be able to grasp or understand because of maybe partly what Paul brought up a bit ago, which is the craft and labor skills that are lost over time, de-skilling, what have you, changes in culture. But also that magic really fundamentally is just key to design work, right? That things that appeal, that seem to work well, that go unquestioned. I don't really want to know in the last instance how everything in my laptop works. I just want to trust it and let it run, right? And so, but I say all this because the idea of demystifying the technology, like better understanding how it worked, can often get aligned with this critique or this concern about magic. But I kind of want the magic too, right? Maybe it sounds like I want my cake and eat it too, but I believe in the appeal of the magic and why people want their technologies to feel again like they're magical, if that makes sense.
Before I sign off, you talked about the Chrysler Turbo car.
Yeah.
I remember seeing a demonstration of that car in a shopping mall when I was 10 years old. And if you're interested, I could connect you with a Chrysler engineer who worked on that car.
Wow. Nice.
Can I?
And a question after that follows up. So as Mr. Powell brought up, he happens to know somebody who was on that engineering team. How significant do you feel that it is that you're able to get, I guess, into these, past projects that or prototypes that you're bringing up, where you're only about a generation or so removed from the people who actually created those versus another 50 years where nobody has no idea of anybody who was involved in this at all?
It's hugely significant. So it would be most palpable, and the difference between some of the earlier projects we did, which were from the mid-19th century, and then more recently the optophonics history. So Dr. Mills, Mara Mills at NYU, is in contact with Harvey Lauer in the UK, who does a lot of archival work and worked with Jameson. And so there's documentation there. There's the history of letters between her and companies as well as Lauer, and there's oral correspondence, right? So really, especially after the 1960s, but definitely in recent history, the role that like oral history has played and the amount of that material is being recorded has been significant for us, right? So I imagine like in the coming years, like histories of technology and media are going to be all the more interesting because of all the kind of, I don't know, paratext or extra material around what's made and that people will be able to look to for the sake of documentation, for the sake of process. But yeah, it's been huge. It was really great to move from the stuff from the 1850s and 60s up to the 1920s, because in the case of the optophone, many of those folks were still living. And if they weren't, we still had correspondence that was either digitized or was in an archive, specifically in the UK. But yeah, I guess another way of putting that is I think it would be great if, it's hard for me to wrap my brain around this because I'm not an expert in it, but I think it would be excellent if industries that are building technologies writ large, developing media, everything from new designs to like new games to films and have you, really kind of could invested in documenting their process such that it could be publicly available later, right? Such that historians, and academics just could get a better sense of how this became that, since we have so many of the technologies that make it available for documentation at this point. I don't know if that's kind of a big question, but yeah, in general, making how this became that more apparent than it has been in the past.
Good night.
Hey, thanks,
Jentery.
Franco.
I think this is very, very fascinating, and I really loved it. And but I continuously try to. So there are a lot of fascinations around here, and I put like a Wikipedia page about a castle that they are building in France, right? And they are building it with just medieval techniques. So they don't use anything. They don't use electricity. They don't do anything like that. It's the modern times. And then as a psychologist, I try to understand what is the fascination with it, right?
Sure.
Also, I saw with Amand and Bob questions and comments, especially the same kind of fascinations that I'm having. But every time that you reply, you kind of say, that's not the point, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting, right? That you are not looking for an easy, everybody's fascinated by what you are saying, but you are saying, that's not the point. That's not the point, right? So a third fascination, and I don't know if this is so now I'm trying to teach with computational methods to my students, and what I know, and I'm not a big expert, right? So what I notice is that what we do is very detached from the beginning of the knowledge of a computational technology, right? It's very, very far away. So sometimes we found ourselves like doing a monkey job, pressing buttons. We don't even really understand what we're doing. And we do that with editing audio, editing video, almost in any situation of technologically grounded work. We don't get to the essence, right? And so my point, my fascination, that maybe is also wrong, is the fact that you are bringing us back to kind of a more rudimental technology that make us maybe understand the basics of it. But I'm almost sure that you are going to say that this is not the point.
I think hopefully I was giving the impression that I kind of wanted both and in most of the other questions. So yeah, I want people to understand how this became that, but also that that knowledge can never necessarily be ascertained, because that's the way labor works and that's the way process happens. You're never going to be able to fully grasp how this became that. But the gesture at it is admirable, right? And the gesture at it is important. For example, so that you can learn that someone like Mary Jameson contributed significantly to the history of optophonics when the history books say nothing about her, or very little about her. But yeah, no, I think I'm all for, so I'll give you a palpable example from the classroom, right? Would be the one of the things I do, I teach often a technology and society class at University of Victoria. It's a 200 level class, usually get first year, second year students. Many of them are in business, some of them are sometimes in engineering, computer science, sometimes in the humanities. It's mostly an interdisciplinary crowd. But one of the first things we do is we read a patent. We go through and they just show them the basics of how to read a patent. And they kind of laugh at it. I was like, what is this? And I'm like, well, look at the language that's used. Do you know how to interpret like the technical language that's used, but also let's look at some advertisements for these. Like, let's look at roughly the same time how this technology is being advertised and how it's patented, and including all the components of the patent, which is, I assume, given your expertise, you would say that's rudimentary, right? The kind of key rudiments. And then usually these end up being devices that never gain cultural traction, right? They never took off in the market or stuff. And they're like, well, the advertisements often say something quite to the contrary, that this will change everything, that this will have a cultural effect that is it's going to be great for investment, or it's going to change how people do X, Y, or Z, right? But yeah, I would say absolutely those rudiments are important. And a follow-up to that is something as basic as asking them to do a simple kind of paper model of what's on the page. I picked this up a little bit from Daniela's work, right? But the idea of just turning what's on the page into a simple 3D diagram so that they can see it in space, they can move around it, and they can create stories with it. But yeah, I think that would be, and for me too, it's as important when you're doing work, say, for example, in histories of literature and culture, where technologies are often referenced, say in a story or by an author, and having a better understanding of what those devices did or how they worked, you can get a better understanding of, why it is that, for example, a modernist author was heavily influenced by film or phonography, because you have a working knowledge of, again, how this became that. But yeah. And I think the rudiments too came back a little bit to is echoed in the remarks I made at the end about low tech, approaches. Because I think my experience was it was very easy to pick up some software or some dependencies, right? Some scripts that are already out there and just use them. And it often obscured or obfuscated the basics, the rudiments, as you said, the foundations that were at play. But and I'll just add, I don't mean to sound like I don't think that producing well-designed products matters. I'm saying I'm in the humanities and you don't want me building bridges, actual bridges, right? People need to do that work. And I'm interested in the histories of how those works happened, especially when prototyping is mostly framed as a kind of future practice, right? It's about speculative, about what's about to happen, or even far future practice. It's rarely about the past. Yeah. I don't know if that, hopefully I didn't say that's not just it. No,
no, no, you didn't.
I have a question about, you mentioned the archivist with kind of specialized knowledge about Mary Jameson a minute ago. And I like thinking about the archivist also as a kind of additional like expert translator in this story, or, and also a maintenance worker. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your use of archives and your collaboration with archivists in your work.
Yeah. So the first thing that was a learning curve for me was the shift from archives primarily for manuscripts, books, and letters, for example, in special collections, artist books, to archives for technologies. Because of what's kept, how it's kept, and what's deemed worthy of being in the archive. And so if, for example, you go to Ottawa and you look in the archives of science and technology, you can walk around just like essentially airport hangars of old tech. And yeah, you could in practice like pull it off a shelf and try to use it. But the idea is that a lot of that is there and very rarely is it exhibited. It's just kind of kept maybe for posterity's sake. But on top of that is the degree to which or when archivists are able to, say they have the capacity, say they have the job description or the support to keep an object going, right? To keep it working over time. And one of the things I found in work with archivists, including communicating with Mara, who works often in archives, is that this is an interesting subject for debate, is how to approach the general question of obsolescence, right? Do you keep the thing as it was brought to you to the archive as is? Or do you figure out a way to kind of, for lack of a better word, rehabilitate it or get it to continue working such that people can interact with it? So is it contained? Is it there to just slowly degrade over time? Or do you, again, try to keep it working? And, of course, there are parallels with this in, say, histories of literature and culture, but it's a little different, especially when things like software and hardware start to get into play, which like more recent technology history of, we have in our library that's just behind me, a center for obsolete computing. It's just full of computers that our librarians are trying to, John Durno in particular, our librarian there, is trying to keep running. So for example, that people can play older games or use older software to have a sense of computing history. And I often encountered that likewise in histories of phonography, say, for example, collections at Syracuse would be notable here, where you have people that have the expertise, not just to keep it, but to use it, like you walk in and you get a demonstration of how the device worked. And the latter was quite rare to me, I think partly because of the lack of funding, but also some folks have already noted maybe because of like the shift in knowledge over time, what's been de-skilled and where capacities have been built elsewhere. But yeah, that's for me the kind of key parallels that like, I can't just go to the object of inquiry that I'm studying in the case of histories of media and technology and expect it to work or have access to it that way. Whereas I think on the whole, usually I can go back and if I want to look for a novel from the 19th century, you might have to handle it delicately or obviously much older, but I can mostly expect it to be there. I can read it. So that's the thing that stood out most to me. And I get on the whole that, arguments for funding, for example, to preserve technologies and media are different sort of funding arguments and then there are parallels in, say, archiving art and literature, but I might be wrong. Did I answer your question adequately?
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, I thought I saw something in the chat. Oh, thanks, Laura. John Willa asked, could hardware be a factor in the efficiency of how many words are read if you use a stronger computer that computes at a faster time to give you better results? Yeah, I'd say most certainly in present day computing, I don't believe that would have been a factor in, say, the 1920s reading optophone, because well, there wasn't software, I guess. But yeah, the use of the selenium and most of the movement for that device would have been manual. So it would have been based on someone guiding the book, guiding the selenium rod to read the book. But yeah, nevertheless, the technology of converting the ink print material into audible tone would have been a hardware question. But I don't think it's quite the same as computing hardware today. It would have been different. I don't know if I'm quite answering the question. I don't know which hardware.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I have, if folks, I'll put it back up just in case. I'm mindful of time, but the slides that I put up at the top, if people want to use those later, I also included some classes that have come out of this some syllabi, more accurately, that have come out of this project. If you want to look at them, they're all online, as well as some infrastructure resources. So lists of what we were using in the lab, for instance. I'll put it here. But if you go to the last two slides, they're there after the thank you slide. I don't know if that would be useful to folks at LTU and elsewhere or not. But I did mention the class exercise earlier with patents. The syllabus for that is after my thank you slide if you want it for a resource.
I don't want to jump the line. Emily, I don't want to cut off anybody who might be chatting from the YouTube, but
Yeah, I don't think we have any questions from the YouTube tonight.
Okay, so I'll just ask one more question, Jentery. I'm probably running out of time soon, but so this is kind of like a nationalist question and disciplinary question combined, because when I think, I get the impression, and this might be totally wrong, that media studies in Canada, you know, coming in the wake of McLuhan and his sort of like attempt to like make everything media studies, has a kind of more capacious set of like sensibility of what its objects are. And I might be wrong because I'm not a media studies scholar here, and it may be that's also the case in the US. But I'm just curious as to, I'm thinking out loud here about what the relationship is between, or what happens when you frame something as technology studies or the history of technology studies versus framing it as media studies. And like, is there an overlap there? Is there and it's not like a territorial get off my lawn type question. I'm really thinking about it from the perspective like humanistic work at a place like LTU, where we kind of have students working on the front lines of both areas, like in the actual like applied sense of things. Like what happens when we think of this as a history of technology versus a history of media?
Yeah. So I'll go back to the classroom context because I feel like sometimes those disciplinary differences are most palpable there. So if I teach technology and society here, I do lean toward science and technology studies and history of science and technology. Whereas when I teach in English, if I do, say, for example, interactive fiction class or contemporary media and fiction class, I look more at things like audio, image, and text. I think one of the key dividing lines, at least in my context, is the emphasis on communication and to some degree experimentation that you see more in media studies, right? You do see across them just often amorphous treatments of both technology and media. Sometimes the same thing can be both of those things. You might be splitting hairs when you look at the optophone to be like, well, there's media and there's technology. But to the other point, I think aside from an emphasis, it tends to be on communication, maybe the history of semiotics, I'd say, in media studies. So not just the McLuhanite tradition, but also the semiotic tradition. Is maybe a little bit more attention to the centrality of something like Peirce's, index sign, an icon, or more generally, the idea that you can look again at media is relationship to language that you may not necessarily see in histories of science and technology in particular. I would also say too that in experiences of history and science and technology, you tend to find more methodical, kind of accepted methodologies for going through it, like how to research a historical technology. Here are the methods that you go through. Here's how you write an article about that history. And they may, be at least formally distinct from some more of the academic work you see in media studies. I'm trying to think of other examples, but yeah, I think the kind of fine line might, for me when I'm teaching, I do say when I'm doing media studies, I tend to emphasize more media and media's relation to language and communication, whereas histories of science and technology, I tend to focus more on this particular technological history, kind of key moments, stress points in that history, and how we understand technology as both a kind of concept and a device. Communication might be kind of in language might be a secondary role in that.
Yeah, and I'll just throw out as a comment your response makes me think of cybernetics as kind of like the Venn diagram overlap between the two, like which is a historical moment. You know what I mean? Like that would be another angle and approach, which has its own problematics as well. But that would be for another conversation, I think.
And yeah, importantly, I should know, like there are people like, if you look at history of phonography, people like Lisa Gittleman at NYU who go and are in both fields, right? Her work on phonography, like coming out of, I think it was early archival work on Edison. You can read that both as media history and history of technology and to some degree science. So yeah. Was that useful? Oh
yeah, no, totally useful. Yeah. It's a fascinating question that I think I was thinking about it in terms of your emphasis on like technology as social relations and not just device, which of course is both lived experience and questions of like labor and care and infrastructure, but then that also bleeds into the linguistic and communication side of it, right? And so and then when I teach my class on literature and technology, we always start with a few McLuhan excerpts. And his example of media are like the electric light and the automobile, right? And so then we get this whole question about like infrastructure and these kinds of things. So yeah, it's almost, I think maybe my non-specialist response would be the way in which the fact that the two questions are kind of in tension in relationship with one another is what makes it a fascinating question for me. Like I'm less interested in saying here's media and here's technology, and more the way we think about them in those kinds of relations.
Sure. I am interested, I know I'm mindful of time, but I'm also interested in the role that fiction plays in both fields. So my pithy response to that is in something like an STS class or science and technology studies class, the role that fiction plays tends to be in the role of like the history of patents, hyperbole in patents or hyperbole in design, how things get communicated as their potential, or in things more recently like design fiction, like the speculative practice of like imagining near or kind of long-term futures by borrowing from things like, speculative fiction. Whereas in media studies, it tends to be more in like, again, roles of like, looking at interactive fiction, right? Or how something like the novel starts to include audio and image and things, everything from the comic to the game to whatever interactive fiction is. Yeah. I just want to say thanks everyone for coming so late and doing this. This has been great, and sorry if I kind of went on in my answers there, but it's been nice to meet everyone, and it's been an honor to have the time to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Jentery. And yeah, that was a really enjoyable talk. Thanks everyone for joining and staying and for the discussion.
Yeah,
thanks to Paul for setting this up.
Thank you, Emily. It's been so much fun. And, this has been a great talk, Jentery. It's great to see you virtually. And, hopefully this will lead to future conversations down the road because this has been a total blast. So thank you all for coming as well. And be safe, everyone.